Episode 18, An Eye for an Eye. The room was bathed in silence. Magnus looked at Keith, who was sitting opposite him, and his brows furrowed deeper and deeper. Magnus knew very well that in this kind of negotiation, whoever made the first request would put themselves on the back foot. But he thought Keith wouldn't know this and would speak first, since he seemed to have the upper hand. But he hadn't expected Keith to be so calm. The younger man didn't have the impetuous temper of most people his age. Sighing inwardly, Magnus finally spoke up. "Tell me, what do you want?" "You've shattered Magnus's desire to gain the upper hand in the negotiation. Attribute point +1. Keith kept his face calm as he said, "Blake, I heard from the Black Snake that you wanted me to do 3 things, and if I satisfied those conditions, he wouldn't kill me. Is that true?" Blake's heart skipped a beat, and a strong sense of unease welled up in his chest. Keith said indifferently, "I'm a fair person. The 3 things you wanted me to do, I'll ask of you in return. If you don't want to do them, fine. I won't break all the bones in your body. However, the headlines tomorrow will tell the tale of a conflict between the heir to one of the country's biggest empires and his love rival. The papers will report how the father of the heir arranged assassins to kill this love rival. You understand what I'm saying, right?" The 3 things that Blake had asked Keith to do were terrifying. Now that they'd been turned on Blake, he was so scared that he couldn't speak. He could only look at his father in panic. Magnus looked at his son with disappointment. Compared to Keith, his son looked like a coward. Magnus hesitated for a moment and said, "Young man, I'm willing to pay to make this trouble go away. Name your price." Keith sneered and said, "Was I talking to you? I asked Blake a question." Magnus said angrily, "Keith, that's enough. Our family won't be trifled with." "All right," Keith said. "If you don't want to talk about it, fine. See you then." Magnus was shocked that Keith was going to leave. He knew that if Keith left, things would get even worse. He hurriedly said, "Oh, wait a minute." Keith paused, and Magnus went on, "I also know about the 3 conditions the Black Snake gave you. I'll give you $200,000 for each one. How about that?" Keith smiled faintly when he heard that. $600,000? It's too cheap for the mighty Carrington family. You don't think I'm an idiot, do you?" Hearing this, Magnus breathed a sigh of relief. If it was a case of not enough money, he could always add more, as long as Keith was willing to negotiate. He said in a deep voice, "How much do you want? Name a price." Keith looked at the businessman, who thought he was smart, and laughed. "Mr. Carrington, it seems you misunderstood me. I'll talk money with you, but not for those 3 things." Magnus's face fell, and Keith said calmly, "You know how the saying goes, an eye for an eye. If you dare to send an assassin after me, you have to bear the consequences. Your son needs to be disciplined. If you don't teach him a lesson, he'll make the same mistake again next time." The 3 members of the Carrington family sucked in a cold breath of air. Keith's intention was obvious. He wanted Blake to be held to the same conditions that the Black Snake had given him. Blake collapsed onto the couch, trembling like a leaf. "You've shattered Magnus's intention to buy his way out of disaster. Attribute point +1. Magnus clenched his fists, but At the sight of Keith's cold gaze, he didn't dare look Keith in the eye. He could see the disdain in the young man's expression, as if he, the powerful Magnus Carrington, were no more than an ant. What kind of person would dare to look at him with such disdain? The powerful man was afraid now. After all, no matter how rich he was still just a businessman. He knew how to talk about business, but in such a dangerous situation, he had no idea what to do. Keith saw that the Carringtons had frozen and sneered. "Well, what is it? I'll count down to 3. If you don't decide by then, you'll just have to wait for the headlines. 3, 2, 1, wait." Magnus seemed to have made up his mind. Without any further warning, he slapped his son and knocked out one of his teeth. Keith was slightly stunned when he saw this. He sat back on the couch and watched Magnus hit his son. The blows reverberated around the room. Magnus ignored his wife's cries and his son's screams. He seemed to be venting his anger as he hit Blake over and over. By the time Magnus stopped, Blake's cheeks had swollen up. Keith looked at Blake, who now had several missing teeth and a blotchy red face. He nodded and said, "Mr. Carrington, you did it for the company. You're a ruthless man." Keith walked over to one of the unconscious bodyguards and picked up the man's baton. He threw it to Magnus and said, "Now, the second one. You can start." "No!" Blake's mom suddenly grabbed her husband's arm and cried, "No, I can't bear to see my son tortured anymore. Don't hit him." Magnus pushed Gwen away and said angrily to Keith, "I'm not as vicious as you are." He picked up the short stick and swung it down toward his son's fingers. "Ah!" Gwen screamed just as the baton was about to hit Blake's hand. A cold light flashed in front of her eyes. A coin hit Magnus's hand, and he dropped the stick. As Keith played with the other coin in his hand and said with a faint smile, "I was just joking. Why would you take it so seriously? Forget it. After all, I've known Blake for a while. His fingers don't need to be broken. You can pay me some compensation for the distress it caused me, and then I'll consider the matter closed." Looking at Blake's bloody face, Keith continued, "But I hope he understands that if he dares to try to retaliate again, it won't be as simple as a few broken fingers next time." When Keith said this, everyone on the scene heaved a sigh of relief. Gwen's entire body shuddered as she cried and hugged her son, who had lost consciousness. You satisfy Magnus and Gwen's desire not to see their son's fingers broken. Wish value +1. Current progress 6 of 10. Magnus sat down on the couch with a bitter smile on his face. "You son of a bitch. If you're really joking, why didn't you say something before I knocked my son's teeth out?" Magnus didn't know why Keith had decided to stop him at the last second, but he'd saved his son's fingers. He felt a twisted sort of gratitude towards their tormentor. Magnus took a deep breath and forced himself to calm down. "How much do you want? I'll transfer the money to you now." Keith thought for a second, and then his face darkened. "Mr. Carrington, if you transfer more than $1 million, the bank will get suspicious. Even now, you still want to scheme against me. I underestimated you.